Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know this episode delves into a difficult topic, including content that might otherwise be uncomfortable, offensive, or triggering to those listening. As such, I have marked this episode explicit. Anyways, let's get started. Hi, my name is Melvin, and what are you doing for Turkey Day? Welcome to Cinematic Doctrine, a Christian podcast service that encourages and equips Christians to engage and reform the culture of cinema. Tonight we'll be looking at Bob Clark's Black Christmas. This movie was chosen by the lovely patrons who support Cinematic Doctrine with a small monthly donation. For as little as $3, you too can have the opportunity to vote for a movie I review at the end of each month by heading over to Cinematic Doctrine's Patreon. A link will be available in the show notes. Released in 1974, Black Christmas is what one might call a proto-slasher. Although the horror subgenre slasher was ignited to popularity with the release of John Carpenter's Halloween, there are plenty of movies released in the years prior that had the same aesthetic as what would become the dominating horror genre of the 1980s. Psycho is most notably the most popular of all proto-slashers, if not slashers in general, even if people don't often consider Hitchcock's titular film a slasher to begin with. But it's Black Christmas that would go on to heavily influence Halloween in the first place, as Carpenter's breakout film was initially to be a Black Christmas sequel. Even so, with all this slasher film talk, I think it's easy to turn one's mind off and roll their eyes at the term, as those slasher films have little in the way of value, if not to only harbor offensive content from start to finish. However, if you decide to continue with me, I think you'll find this review both enlightening and convincing that the slasher genre has far more to offer than dead teenagers and mindless violence. So let's get started. Let me tell you what Bob Clark's Black Christmas is all about. Christmas break is right around the corner, and the sorority ladies of Pi-Kappa-Sigma are celebrating a Christmas party before everyone heads home. That is until Barb, played by Margot Kidder, receives a call from her mother. She's busy, and Barb won't be able to come home. Feeling resentful, Barb hangs up, wondering who her mother's going to be spending her holidays with, and drinks the evening away. Meanwhile, Jess, Phil, and Claire, played by Olivia Hussey, Andrea Martin, and Lynn Griffin respectively, are enjoying the festivities until the last moments of the evening. And as their boyfriends start to head home, Jess hears the phone ring again. This time, it's the man they call the Moaner. His vulgar calls have become a norm for the women of Pi-Kappa-Sigma, and they crowd around to hear his heinous speech over the phone line. Barb then takes the phone, intending to play along, but not before the man mutters, "I'm going to kill you," and hangs up. Claire, disgusted, warns Barb not to lead him on. She warns of extreme acts of violence that have been happening to other women on campus, let alone the women outside of the college grounds. But Barb lets it slide, acting as though it's a childish game. And if that's not enough, Jess and her boyfriend Peter, played by Keir Dullea, are at a crossroads. Jess is pregnant, and she's not so sure she wants to keep the baby. Peter desperately wants to talk about it, but it must wait. He has a recital coming up, and while he wants nothing more than for Jess to keep the child, he can't take time off from practicing. So Jess waits at PK's house, struggling with her moral quandary amidst holiday fanfare. December only grows worse as, one by one, the women of Pi-Kappa-Sigma go missing. So begins the horrendous holiday that is Black Christmas. Black Christmas is rated R. It has no detailed certificate, so here's my own certificate. Frightening images, violence and gore, brief sexual imagery, mild nudity, occasional vulgar speech, strong language, and crude humor. Let's cover this in order. The film is frightening due to the violence, let alone it being violence against women, which is always harder to watch. And while frightening images can include acts of violence, some of it also comes along with the general tension of the film, as the payoff to the tension is often a surreal aftermath following a violent act. I included gore as there is one brief scene toward the end that I would constitute as gore, but in all honesty the film isn't graphic in the least. In fact, I would call Black Christmas a psychological horror, as there really isn't all that much blood or graphic content. It's more about the visuals, premise, etc. Even so, I still felt it important to mention this in my own custom certificate. The brief sexual imagery has to do with a poster during one scene that shows a rear end during a sensual act. This poster is played off for a bit of laughs, but that still doesn't change the fact that the image contains real nudity. There's also a poster in the middle of the film that is inappropriate, but the poster is in someone's hands and neither focused nor angled appropriately for it to be properly seen. Also played for laughs, there's a police officer in a scene who, unrelated to the entire plot, has been shot in the butt, and there's a brief scene where in the background you see it. It's strange, and I think it's just Bob Clark throwing in his comedy. Even so, it's still present and therefore constitutes mild nudity along with the posters. The occasional vulgar speech is perhaps the crudest aspect of the film, as the moaner says some undeniably horrific things throughout the film. Most notably, the first phone call is diabolical, and while it's only in speech, it's still extremely uncomfortable. That said, the scene is written to be uncomfortable, and even the women listening are petrified by the things he's saying. Not only that, director Bob Clark makes sure to let us see their disgust as he's showing the other side of such horrid objectification. Barb also has a few inappropriate dialogues with other characters as she inhabits the promiscuous character of the sorority. There's never anything visual involving her character, simply dialogue, but her speech may still be uncomfortable for some viewers. The strong language is largely due to the vulgar language the moaner uses over the phone. He uses a lot of highly provocative language, 2 words that start with C and 1 with P. So I'll let you figure that one out. Apart from that, there are only 5 words that would largely be considered curse words throughout the runtime, and only one of them being the F word. And finally, the crude humor. This comes from Barb. As you may be suspecting, there are also some jokes that take place during a Christmas celebration held at Pi-Kappa-Sigma house for the local children, which amounts to college students cursing at Santa Claus while a child is on his lap. I'll be the first to say that I really dislike that kind of humor. The kind that basically borders on irreverent behavior heightened by the presence of children. In fact, it's something I despise with a passion and outright offends me more than anything else in a film. Black Christmas is no exception, and I want to make that clear before we start rolling into the review. And it goes without saying that the subplot regarding abortion may be difficult for most viewers to engage, and I want to share that the film handles this weighty ethical topic with respect and maturity. At least that's how I stepped away from it. Other viewers may feel differently. Now, before we take a look at Black Christmas, I wanted to share real quick that if you've come to enjoy Cinematic Doctrine and would like to support the show, be sure to leave a review on your respective podcast app at the end of this episode. You can also check out 2 new shows featured under Cinematic Doctrine called Trailer Talk and Monthly Movie News, if you're interested in more content. And be sure to check out cinematicdoctrine.com, where you can also get connected with our social media. Also, Cinematic Doctrine has a Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can join other patrons and vote on a movie I review once a month, as well as take joy in feeding my coffee addiction. Any amount is appreciated with multiple tiers to choose from, all of which go toward making Cinematic Doctrine the best podcast it can be. You may still be recovering from the certification, and so I want to address that first and foremost. While this film has a lot of content I dislike, from the use of nudity for a joke or the irresponsible use of children, virtually everything mentioned prior is sparingly used, and perhaps the most egregious aspect of the film is that the worst of it is tailored for the first act of the film. It's almost like a bait and switch, as though Bob Clark is giving people what they want before he strips away the facade and says, actually my film is a lot smarter than you think. Commonly, when people think of slasher films, they associate them with a sleaze fest that has tons of gore. And while the worst of the slasher genre has to offer is most definitely exploitative trash, see 10 of the 11 Friday the 13th films, like any genre out there, you'll find not only standouts, but exceptionally good films. But this is a strange way to start a review for Black Christmas. How in the world would Bob Clark be bait and switching his audience in the first act if the standard conventions for slasher movies won't be immortalized for another 4 years? I think if anything, Bob Clark is simply bait and switching a common perspective on college students, as he felt that young adults weren't being properly depicted in film. In fact, he wanted the film to capture, as he says, the astuteness of young adults. They're not fools, he would go on to say. It's not all bikinis, beach blankets. And so, in a way, I wonder if the first act was a bit of an irony. He wanted to show the characters being, perhaps, a little stupid at times, or even irresponsible. Even so, he still had real child actors in the same room as a character angrily cussing in a Santa costume. So it doesn't change the fact that, despite whatever irony I perceive from these choices, he still ended up doing something I really, really dislike in movies. And yet, Bob Clark is also known for directing everyone's favorite holiday movie, A Christmas Story. And there are some things that others might say are irresponsible in that film when looking at the standard I'm setting here. And while that may be partially true, I think there's a different heart and maturity behind things like Ralphie going, "Oh, fudge," than, again, a college student muttering the actual F word with a child on his lap. If anything, it simply means Bob Clark matured in how he executes a joke like that. Or the production company simply said, "You can't have Ralphie curse," and he went along with it because a paycheck is a convincing argument. Even so, the juxtaposition presented throughout the rest of the film isn't all that unexpected. Like the fact that our first act is irreverent and immature with the latter two acts growing in maturity isn't unexpected. At least it shouldn't be unexpected. The start of the film is a college party that's all too typical in sorority or fraternity films, and while it isn't nearly as, inappropriate as modern films may depict a sorority or fraternity party, it's still a fun time, only for Barb to receive that sad phone call from her mother. It's a pretty heartbreaking tone setter, and it helps humanize a character that I think we're quick to see as a caricature or satire on college students, let alone promiscuity. And I think I want to talk about that last bit too. Barb as a character isn't actively promiscuous, but her speech patterns make it clear that sexuality is not something she's ashamed of. And when this is put side by side with Claire, who seems appropriately prudish, Jess, who is engaged in a moral dilemma due to her sexual choices, and Phil, who emotionally grounds the other characters, it almost starts to feel as though each character plays different parts of the same role. Now, I have some really interesting thoughts to share off that thread, but I have to briefly mention a few practical things about this movie that I really enjoyed. First, that cinematography is fantastic. Reginald H. Morris was the director of photography for Black Christmas, and there are some beautiful shots that are just so creative for a film set largely in one home. There are some shots where Jess is on the phone and we see her through the reflection in a mirror. On the mirror is either a wreath or a hanging plant, and it looks like a crown laid across her head. Or another sequence outside, where a character has investigated something in the snow and a light is flared across the lens of the camera. Even the way the camera floats around PK's house creates an undeniable sense of unease, and that's only made worse when a few scenes involve an incredibly convincing POV of the killer. Second, the soundtrack is used sparingly but effectively, with a few holiday songs as well as some haunting atmospheric ambience created by Carl Zittrer, who tied utensils and combs to the strings of a piano. It breaks down the otherwise romantic sensation a piano creates, further advancing the tone of the film being filled with loneliness, frightfulness, and mystery amidst the most festive time of the year. Third, this might be the most frightening slasher I've ever seen, and it's not even all that graphic. I know I keep saying that, like in every review I cover for a horror movie. It's not even all that graphic. Well, it isn't. It's the suspense that really does it here. I was on the edge of my seat watching this movie, and I could feel my skin crawl with anxiety. It was just insane. And fourth, John Saxon, who plays Lieutenant Ken Fuller in this film, also plays Lieutenant Thompson in the film Nightmare on Elm Street, so basically he's the same character across each film. Go ahead and start making your own headcanon about how the two are in the same universe. I just had to touch on those aspects of this movie. I couldn't really figure out a comfortable way to bring this up, and I was already starting to get ahead of myself, so I decided I just had to throw them in here. Anyways, back to what I was saying. I mentioned that I feel as though the women of Pi-Kappa-Sigma feel as though they play different parts of the same role, and that role is, in a sense, the role of second-wave feminism. That might sound a little strange, so let me explain. It's not so much that they're personifying particular characteristics of second-wave feminism in an awkward, cartoonish, unrealistic fashion. It feels more like Barb, Jess, Claire, and Phil are supposed to handle different traits of very real, very tangible, very relatable female characters. Let's break it down. Barb is a promiscuous, unashamed, confident woman who would rather take control of a situation than let the situation take control of her. If that means playing along with a perverse man, seizing conversation and twisting it for her own gain, or manipulating stupid men for her own amusement, she will. And all of this when the backdrop to her character is a phone call where her mother says, "You'll have to stay here, I'm with another man this Christmas." It's no wonder Barb is so unabashedly controlling, callous, and irreverent. And perhaps the most humanizing characteristic about Barb is that she has an inhaler. That sounds so strange to say out loud. But there's a vulnerability to that characteristic that simply explains how rich and complex she is as a woman. Claire is intelligent, aware of the world around her. She's anything but naive, and she plays it safe, because she knows the world outside can be indifferent to a young woman such as herself. But there's still a side of her that's yearning to break free, wanting to break stereotypes and common conventions. She's not sitting back and letting other people take care of her. She wants to make a statement, too. I think this is most evident with the posters hanging in her room. Most comically is a poster of an old woman sitting in a nice gown who, over a series of photos, proceeds to sit up and shove her middle finger into the camera lens with an angry scowl. Phil is caring and emotional, perhaps the most expressive of all the women in Pi-Kappa-Sigma, as she lends an ear to a friend in a crisis or weeps into Jess's shoulder over horrible news. But she isn't helpless. She takes her deep emotions and puts them into action as she joins a search party for a missing girl or talks things out with those in her vicinity. And Jess, who not only carries the weight of the film on her shoulders, also carries the heavy burden of an all too common moral dilemma. She has dreams, aspirations, a career she wants to engage, and all of that may be on indefinite hold with her pregnancy, unless she chooses to terminate, of course, in which case she supposes her life will return to normal. And that struggle is only heightened by a boyfriend who is more engaged with his career than his relationship. So she's left on her own to labor these incredibly difficult questions. In short, these are exceptional characters, and the drama alone would be enough to keep one's attention. And we haven't even talked about the murderer, or as the genre dictates, the slasher of this film, and who or what they represent. When it comes to Black Christmas, especially when you consider that the film was released in 1974 during second-wave feminism and, the sexual revolution, I couldn't help but feel as though our slasher is nothing more than a metaphor. Ooh, deep, Melvin. He's a metaphor. It's all a metaphor. Everything's a metaphor. I know, I get it. How film student of me. Just let me explain. The sexual revolution was a period during the 1960s and 1980s in Western culture where normal conventions of sexuality were being heavily debated and reworked. Traditional heterosexual marital engagements were being challenged in some sense, but the primary pursuit was to normalize alternative sexual experiences. I don't need to get into details on what that means, but it's important to recognize that this wasn't necessarily the first time traditional heterosexual marriage was under attack, as this took place in the late 1800s into the early 1900s as well. But for obvious reasons, we're sticking to the 60s through the 80s. Because, the film released in 1974. But it's important to note that this wasn't the first time these conventions were under attack, as things like this just don't happen. They brew like a soft simmer on a stove. Cultures are constantly cooking new ways to change, and unfortunately, the sexual revolution was one of those cases. Apart from the horrid after effects such as the normalization of perverse literature and film, there were also medical travesties that took place amidst and after the sexual revolution, as even the following AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was an aftershock of increased non-traditional sexual engagement. Now, let's start by saying this. The sexual revolution sucked. I think many people are starting to realize this, culturally speaking, as we continue to suffer the aftershocks of an increasingly sexual culture. Many of the things the West struggles with, such as teen pregnancy, sexual assault, exploitation of minors, STDs, abortion, were happening during and then heightened because of the sexual revolution. And as a Christian, this is without getting into the most obvious problem. It's sinful. Sex outside of heterosexual marriage is an affront to God, just like any other sin is an affront to God, and therefore shouldn't be encouraged. So the sexual revolution, in that sense, is a bad thing. Now, other things get wrapped up with the sexual revolution, involving the women's movement of the 1960s, and I think it's important to make the distinction here that the film Black Christmas isn't so much a film I would put in the category of sexual revolution, and more in the category of second-wave feminism. The reason I spent that time giving a background in the sexual revolution is because the two, in a manner of speaking, go hand in hand, as second-wave feminism pursued a cultural shift in how women are perceived and respected, while encouraging them to pursue worthwhile, fulfilling work. You see, statistically speaking, women who become pregnant are less likely to become financially successful than women who don't become pregnant, And while women are being encouraged to engage their individuality through the workplace, the culture surrounding them is encouraging everyone to engage their individuality sexually. And we all know what the result of sex is. No wonder then that a worldly ideology seeking to encourage cultural promiscuity is met with a worldly solution in abortion. And while I'm not really on the market to talk about abortion with this episode, you can't avoid it when the film covers it heavily in one of its subplots. Black Christmas, at its core, feels like a response to the sexual revolution. And that response comes from a voice of second-wave feminism, and each character, as we noted, shows different individual characteristics of women. Because, they're people, not products or consumers. So with this new perspective in mind, let's contrast each character against the metaphor that is the killer, the sexual revolution. Barb, who has likely dealt with her mother's negligence since childhood, decides the best way to combat her feelings of loneliness and abandonment is to overtake them in a dominant manner, responding to catcalls with flirtatious teasing, one-night stands, and immersing herself in sexual pleasures, because a numbing lifestyle is far more bearable than a painful one. But we know this doesn't work. Like Claire warns in the beginning of the movie, the moaner over the phone shouldn't be encouraged. It could lead to something horrible, and as the film moves forward in typical slasher fashion, it does. When you input the picture Barb paints in a real-world setting, it's perhaps the closest image we get of both the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism, that the response to an ever-growing sexual culture is to embrace it. Despite the fact that it's one that objectifies women to such a vile degree, it's culturally killing them. Of course, in the case of Black Christmas, it's literally killing them. And then there's Claire, the budding young woman of sorority Pi-Kappa-Sigma who wants to do more for herself, for women, for those she loves. And when you input her into the real-world setting, you witness the fresh start of a woman who's ready to embrace her individuality, cautiously navigating the world. But sometimes the world doesn't wait for you to trip up, stumble and fall, and become vulnerable to attack. Those who are pure at heart are going to get caught in the crossfire. And you can see that in the example of sexual harassment in the workplace, whether through overt physical contact or unsolicited remarks, and most horribly, indiscriminate sexual assault. And even Phil, I believe, could be put alongside Claire in this case, as her involvement in Black Christmas, while important, is largely innocuous. She's a great support for her friends, actively outwardly expressing a caring, selfless heart in the way she cares for those around her. And while I must say there isn't explicitly anything in her character that, I feel, would easily paint the picture of feminism versus sexual revolution, she has an amazing scene that's both comical and enlightening later in the film that fits the feminist bill. Phil and Jess are at home doing some menial tasks when a man's face shows up in the window. Phil shrieks and Jess runs over to make sure everything's okay just before there is a knock at the door. They're panicked, especially when the one man is carrying a shotgun, but soon find out they're only men on patrol for whoever's killing women. Citizens patrol, nothing more. But the scene lingers, and these two older men, again one with a shotgun, are aggressively asking the women questions, who are visibly uncomfortable, about whether they knew someone was missing, have seen anything suspicious, and are safe. And when Jess tries to shut the door after assuring them that they're fine, the men would keep propping it open with their feet or hands so they could keep speaking to them, completely missing context clues over and over that, I don't know, maybe they should leave? It's an amazing scene because it really is kind of funny, especially when Jess locks the door and remarks, this is the only door or window we can lock in this house. But it also briefly paints this picture of how these men, while doing a good thing, inadvertently are doing a bad thing, namely disrespecting women. I mean, come on, dudes. The second you saw it was two young women at the door, you should have said your piece and moved on. It is so inappropriate to do what you're doing. Just stop shoving a gun in their face. And I guess I'd put this forward to the female listeners. How many times have you had this sort of thing happen? I know my wife has had to politely expedite a conversation with men when she's alone, or even when she's with people knowing full well it's headed in an inappropriate direction. In reviewing this episode, my wife reminded me of a lot of situations like this. And it may not be intentional that a man is talking this way, but just because someone isn't aware of their disrespect or inappropriate behavior doesn't absolve their responsibility. And then finally you have Jess, who's determined in her studies, has dreams and aspirations for her career, and wants to pursue more than simply being a Stepford wife. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you pair that alongside the sexual revolution, you can see why she might ponder the question of abortion. When you put into perspective the cost a child has on both career and financial success, when you see that businesses seldom provide maternal or paternal leave, when you recognize the exorbitant price for daycare, when you recognize firsthand the socially isolating experience of being a stay-at-home parent, no wonder Jess and so many other women turn to abortion for a solution. Is abortion the right choice? No, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm simply trying to paint the picture here of a few key factors that might feed into this thought process. But the first mistake was premarital sex. The first mistake is consciously separating marriage, sex, and procreation. And while sex isn't primarily intended to be a means of procreation, it is intended to primarily be engaged in covenant marriage, because ideally, there's confidence in the support provided among the marriage unit, extended family, and even the church if you have one. Which, by the way, you should have one. And perhaps as an aside, the sexual revolution wasn't merely a pursuit to normalize alternative sexual experiences, but also emphasize that the church may have been insufficiently preaching on sex, not painting the proper God-honoring picture that in marriage, it's a gift to engage with one another, to enjoy such intimate vulnerability emotionally, physically, and even spiritually. Or perhaps the church didn't talk about sex at all, and therefore as sexual beings, because we are sexual beings, that's how we're made, there was an intense repression of questions and feelings and struggles. So the bubble burst. And bubbles are messy. So Jess's conundrum is almost a movie in its own right. In fact, I feel as though the entire abortion subplot could be considered unrelated or even inappropriate considering the film itself. What is a slasher film doing with such a serious subplot? But as I've argued, the film released far into both the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism, so it seems plausible to me that the point is to continue that theme and tone with this subplot. And we can't talk about Jess without talking about her boyfriend Peter, who is just as responsible for her pregnancy as she is. But perhaps the biggest difference is that, unlike Jess, Peter isn't suffering the consequences in the same way. Regardless of whether Jess is pregnant or not, Peter's career isn't affected in the least, both from his own perspective and culturally. His dreams for the future don't change at all. If she's pregnant, that's great. If she's not, that's great too. Because as far as he's concerned, his career is fine. And what I think Jess's character and subplot reveals about the film is that a big focus of Black Christmas is to emphasize the victims of the sexual revolution. In this case, women. I'll keep this brief because it's such a cyclical thing. But Barb is responding to a life of negligence because of her mother's own promiscuity, and in turn propagates promiscuity. Claire represents the idealist who can see the good in both second-wave feminism, the pursued individuality of women, and the sexual revolution, which at its best causes us to reform our views on sex beyond purely a practice for procreation. Phil is stuck in the middle of all this chaos and plays an integral character who supports those in need. And Jess is literally in the thick of it, weighing the options presented to her by both the sexual revolution and second-wave feminism, having to reconcile both the fact that she's stuck between them and that the two are grossly incompatible. And the killer, the slasher, the moaner? The reality is, it's too late. He represents the failure of these two worldviews clashing against one another. The sexual revolution did nothing more than advance the grotesque objectification of women, creating men that sought to increase their conquest of the female body. Let's sleep with 1, 2, 3 women. Let's try this. Let's try that. Ultimately, this does nothing more than turn sex into a self-gratifying experience. And at some point, that wears out. But you've been told sex is the most enlightening experience of anything this world can offer. So you try more and more until more extreme sex is required, and now you're stuck leaving horrid phone calls on the Pi-Kappa-Sigma call receiver. Or murdering women because it doesn't matter whether they're dead or alive. They're just objects. There's immense hyperbole in Black Christmas because the majority of men in real life aren't going around murdering women. But sexual promiscuity does nothing more than feed the ego for the worse. And we can't talk about this without mentioning Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer of the 1970s, some of which were in 1974, who he himself said that, in an interview, alluding to his own fascination of pornography, that the only way someone could do the things he was being tried for would be through systematic objectification of women. Now, am I ignoring men and the toll the sexual revolution has on them? Yeah. I mean, that's not what the movie is about. The movie is purely focused on the female perspective. That's not to say there isn't a male cost. There is. In fact, there's another huge cost, and it's in the children. We see that example in Barb as someone who was brought up by a mother who thoroughly embraced sexual experiences over motherhood, at least we can assume. And we also see this in the abortion subplot. But the thing is, this film is focused on engaging and understanding the female perspective and painting it through the lens of a slasher film. So as far as this discussion is concerned, we have to focus on what the film is going for. And while Black Christmas hyperbolizes the effects of the sexual revolution amidst second-wave feminism, it also takes the time to paint the objectifying nature that can grow in men naturally, as Peter isn't all that great of a guy, let alone boyfriend, either. He basically says to Jess, "Yeah, I know you're pregnant, and yeah, I know you want to kill our baby, but I have to practice for this recital. That's way more important." Like, come on, dude! And he really seems to treat Jess like a commodity, like something he owns, like something he can stuff into a schedule, like something he can manipulate for his own gain. And I'll go out on a limb here and say it might even be safe to assume that the pregnancy happened because of his own willing irresponsibility. They most definitely shouldn't have been fornicating in the first place. There's no doubt about that. But Peter's manipulation is so sinister, there's even a line where Jess defends his rude behavior as simply a characteristic of his artistic personality. Like, no, sweetie, you don't have to apologize for him being a total dirtbag. Come on, Jess. Say it like it is. He's a jerk. And I think when stepping away from Black Christmas, despite its 1974 release, the problem presented within the film, and the subsequent victims thereof, are very much still real today. It's still here. It hasn't gone away. The phone is still ringing. Pornography is rampant and easier to acquire than ever. Sexual harassment in the workplace is commonplace. Hookup culture is now casual culture. And even the movie itself, ironically enough, suffers the layover of the sexual revolution, as the film itself features brief yet real nudity. So where does that put us now? Kind of in a hopeless place, doesn't it? Fortunately, it seems our culture is recognizing, at the very least, the aftermath of the sexual revolution, what with the Me Too movement, social reforms, and the like. There is a bit of a struggle in the fact that culture wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to encourage sexual exploration, while discouraging basically everything bad about that. But there's something good to the natural common grace budding out of the aftermath. However, most importantly, the church itself seems to be slowly but surely opening up about proper sexual engagement. That it's more than procreation. It's an explicit, intimate act of love between spouses. And the church is also recognizing that there is a healthy way to fight against these sexual sins. One way is by not demonizing individuals who struggle with sexual sins, especially in the LGBTQ+ crowd. Because the reality is, all sins can be paid for by the precious blood of Christ. To think that there is even one sin that the Lord cannot atone for would simply imply that sin, in effect, is more powerful than He is. If that's the case, then He's not God, because God is all-powerful. Thankfully, the Lord has been working in His people to help Him recognize this truth, which not only helps to invite individuals in the LGBTQ+ community through the front door of your local church, it also helps to encourage the church to recognize and reconsider the Lord's sovereignty, which, by the way, is infinite. The church has learned to recognize that sexual sin can often be the product of other deeply rooted sins or sufferings. I can't stop mentioning Barb because, goodness, she's such a good character in this movie, but she's also a good example of this. Who else has sought out sexual sins like they would a Band-Aid? It can be a numbing experience to a lot of the pains of the world. The church is learning to recognize the necessity for vulnerability, not only for the one engaging in sexual sin, but also for the pastor, elder, family member, or friend to hear these deeply rooted issues shared from the heart. So it's not hopeless, but sometimes it feels that way. Because like Black Christmas, there's someone out there who is an absolute maniac, exploiting people sexually, physically, and emotionally for their own personal gain. And I think that evaluation must start at home. And I'm going to address both men and women here. How are you objectifying others? Are you overtly objectifying men and women through sexual means? Because if you are, quit it. Confess your sins to the Lord, seek forgiveness from those you've exploited, and start aggressively attacking this sinful, evil quality in your heart. But maybe your struggle is more like Peter. Maybe you're a subtle manipulator. You know how to control people through your words and emotions and have absolutely no need for physical control. If that's the case, you need to stop it just as much as the other guy. Both are affronts to God, completely dehumanizing, and lack any recognition of the image-bearing quality of your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, or, every human being in existence. And I want to leave that off with some biblical encouragement. I touched on it before, but I want to make clear, these sins can be defeated. In fact, they're already defeated in Christ for those who trust in Him. So hear the words of 1 Corinthians 6, 9-11, which come as an exhortation and an encouragement wrapped up nicely with a bow. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by the Spirit of our God. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Cinematic Doctrine. If you've seen Black Christmas, what did you think of it? Do you think it's one of the best slashers ever made, or do you think it goes a tad too far into the offensive? If you're listening on Cinematic Doctrine's website, let me know in the comments below, or shoot me an email to cinematicdoctrine@gmail.com. If you're on Letterboxd, I have a list compiling every movie I've reviewed on Cinematic Doctrine with direct links to those episodes, so be sure to check that out. And consider following me on Letterboxd for quick, bite-sized reviews on every movie I watch. If you'd like to support the show, jump on over to Cinematic Doctrine's Facebook page and be sure to follow for updates on episodes, movie news, and my usual shenanigans. From there, you can also get connected with the Cinematic Doctrine Facebook group and join the conversation. You can also support the show by leaving a review for Cinematic Doctrine on your respective podcast app. And if that's not enough, head on over to Cinematic Doctrine's Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can join other patrons and vote on a movie I review once a month, as well as take joy in feeding my coffee addiction. In fact, this was one such movie. So thank you very much to my fellow patrons. And remember, any amount is appreciated with multiple tiers to choose from. All of it will go toward making Cinematic Doctrine the best podcast it can be. A special shout out to those who support at the Art House Theater tier. Thank you so much, Mom and Dad. You're the best. All of this will be available in the show notes. Until next time, stay cool.